as they said, but feeling much better as the day has gone by. All right. So it looks like we're live on, as they said, looks like we're live on YouTube. And tonight, which is episode 59, we're going to be talking about cardiovascular risk and why it's important to think about that. And in my background is Positano, I think, in Italy, and an amazing place that I would like to go travel to at some point. Okay, so let me share my screen and we will get started. So probably I would say that this will probably be a little bit abbreviated just because I didn't feel that well today because of the shot. But it looks like a small presentation, but I think it's actually a very important one. And I think it's important because there have been some negative trends in public health that are concerning. And I truly believe that all of you need to be up on the labs that you need to be aware of to assess your risk. Unfortunately, you can't necessarily rely on your doctor when it comes to ordering all the labs. They have kind of the labs that they're used to doing, and those are good labs. But what I'd like to share with you tonight, and I've done this before, is to go into a little bit more depth with some of the labs that I think everyone should be getting at some point. And I think it should be done on a yearly basis. And I think, believe it or not, that you should be ordering it for yourself. I've gotten a lot of sort of, not flack, but I've discussed this with some of my doctor colleagues, and some of them are somewhat resistant to patients ordering their own labs. But I think, as I always say, that my goal is for you to become your own authority in health, and as a result of that, you should understand what labs that you can evaluate on your own. In the United States now, you can order your own labs. There are labs. There's a company called Any Labs Now. There are a whole host of labs, that you can go in and you can order your own tests and pay for. Unfortunately, it might not be covered by insurance necessarily. So obviously, you should, be open to discuss with your doctor to order some of these tests so that you have some idea about what your cardiovascular risk is beyond, your blood sugar and your blood pressure and your LDL and your HDL. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about all of those. And I would hope that at the very end of tonight's class that you will feel empowered to actually go and order your own labs. Because ultimately, I think that if you're on this class, you obviously want to have a little bit more depth of knowledge to your overall health. And as all of you know, my goal is to look at health from a longevity perspective. In other words, what's going to give you the most, what they call health span, which is, how many years of life you have that you are healthy. And I don't think it's possible for you to really optimize that, as you get older, and older meaning middle age, we'll talk, 45 to 65 and up. That's when you need to take a little bit more control over your health and know the labs and not rely necessarily on your doctor, or find a physician like myself who enjoys looking at these labs and giving you feedback on those labs, but not a doctor necessarily that's just getting your routine LDL, HDL, triglycerides, blood sugar, etc. So that's really what my focus is. So let's talk a little bit about the trends in cardiovascular risk, because they actually are very, very concerning. So from 1980 to 2014, there was actually a 50% decrease in cardiovascular risk. Cardiovascular risk being really defined as, as heart attacks, strokes, etc. 1968, that was the peak of heart disease. And it dropped after that due to a whole host of societal and medical interventions. So first was a decrease in tobacco use. So when that started to decrease, heart disease started to decrease. The efficacy of things like angioplasty and stenting also helped with reducing the mortality of heart disease. Overall drops in LDL from various pharmaceuticals also was responsible for a drop in the peak. Use of aspirin for secondary prevention, meaning someone who had a heart attack and then afterwards, the use of aspirin was helpful in preventing another type of cardiac event, and then reduced blood pressure. So as well. So all of these five things that we discussed were basically responsible for dropping the cardiovascular risk from its peak in 1968. Unfortunately, now middle-aged people from 45 to 64, it's actually been increasing. And I put this chart on here because it shows what we're dealing with when it comes to diabetes and obesity. So obviously, red is the highest BMI, and so from 1994 to 2015, we see a real increase, dramatic increase, and same thing with diabetes. So 1994, and then 2015, you see this remarkable change, and it's obviously concerning. And a lot of people come up with various opinions as to why this increase. Some people say that, for when heart disease was at its peak, there was sort of the dogma that we needed to cut fat, and now we realize that might have not been the best thing for people because people's carbohydrate intake started to increase as the regular guidelines started to push for, food companies were making, quote, low-fat foods, but they were also loaded with processed carbohydrates. I always like to think that we're not, impacted so much with some of the trends that are happening. But ultimately, unfortunately, being part of the society that we live in, we are influenced sometimes in ways that we're not even aware of when it comes to sort of this notion that fat is bad, and we know that fat is not bad in and of itself. There's certainly different kinds of fat, and certainly spoken about how vegetable oils are often oxidized, so they're really pretty terrible for you. But traditional fats that have been used in cultures like olive oil, thinking of Italy in the background there, sesame oil in places like India, and in Asia. So there are traditional fats that obviously are not necessarily a concern. So unfortunately, so some people think that a lot of this is a sort of happened because of this notion that fat was bad, and therefore, obesity and diabetes both sort of increased. Right now, in middle-aged people, 40% are obese, 30% are overweight. We reviewed those sort of definitions in the past, which basically means 70% of people are overweight in the United States. Remarkable 10.5% have diabetes, and 20% with diabetes don't know they have it. I've spoken about before about how pre-diabetes comes with medical issues. Some of the damage of diabetes already is starting when you have pre-diabetes, and there are there are tons of people out there who have pre-diabetes and they don't even know it. And you don't necessarily have to be overweight to have pre-diabetes. There are certain genes that people can have that sometimes I run on patients where we look at their genetics. That there's one gene in particular that's sort of called the skinny diabetes gene, where people have this sort of genetic this gene that if they're eating a lot of grains, they are predisposed to diabetes and they might be thin. So this is another one of those things that is important for you to really have a clear grasp of in terms of knowing what your numbers are. I can't stress it enough. I think the overriding message for tonight, and of course, I spoke about this many, many weeks ago, where I reviewed some of the tests that I really think are valuable for people to know beyond cardiovascular risk. We're focusing in on that, but there is a video, it's on my YouTube channel, the 7 blood tests that you should know. And if there is something that is going to repeat more and more, is that I really think you need to have a clear grasp of your numbers so that you can follow this and you can know what kind of changes that you can make and know what's going on in your body. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened here. Let's see. Okay, so next steps. So it turns out that really, when it comes to the most important factors in terms of the trends, blood pressure, getting your blood pressure in order, getting your cholesterol in order, getting your hemoglobin A1C in order, is going to reduce your risk dramatically. So this chart shows that what happens to cardiovascular disease events and coronary heart disease events when you tackle 1, 2, or 3 of these factors. So if you get blood pressure under control, you get LDL cholesterol under control, you get hemoglobin A1C under control, you're getting reduction in risk of 62 and 60%. So obviously, we should all know what our blood pressure is. You can buy a very cheap home blood pressure monitor, or when you go to the pharmacy, they often have the blood pressure monitors. You really should know what your blood pressure is running. A lot of people don't know. I ask my patients sometimes if we're not getting their before they get their blood pressure taken, if they know. Most people don't have really that much of an idea of what their blood pressure is if they're healthy, if they feel like they're healthy. But unfortunately, you can't feel that your blood pressure is elevated. And the damage that is done to your body when your blood pressure is elevated is something of concern, even though you might feel healthy. So it's something that you, again, another one of these body metrics that you really should know about. Cholesterol, of course, most of you probably know that. We're going to go into a little bit more detail going deeper into some of the blood tests. And then hemoglobin A1C we've spoken about before, which is basically the average of your blood sugar over the last 2 or 3 months. It's basically when sugar binds to protein in your red blood cell, and your red blood cell isn't around forever. It lasts, like 120 days. So when you know the percentage of sugar bound to the red blood cell, it gives you an idea of what your blood sugar has been over the last 2 or 3 months, basically. Okay, so the question is, well, we've spoken about how terrible it is in terms of your risk when you are overweight, but it turns out that, again, if you control if you get rid of your diabetes, your high blood pressure, and correct your triglycerides, there actually is a huge reduction in risk, hardly any risk at all, in fact. Well, there is risk, but it's much, much decreased. So that means that, within a short period of time, even if you haven't lost a significant amount of weight, but you've started to get your diabetes under control and your high blood pressure and your triglycerides and your cholesterol in order, that your overall risk is going to, improve. So you're not doomed if you're overweight. You just need to focus on these sorts of things that we're talking about, getting your blood pressure, cholesterol, and hemoglobin A1C in order. And honestly, oftentimes, especially when you get when you get all this under control, it means, generally speaking, that you're living a healthier life and you probably will have weight loss in general. Okay, So that's sort of what we're looking at. Now let's take a look at some of the labs that I think that some of you might consider ordering for yourself. The first one is called the NMR Lipo Profile. Now, all of you have gotten your LDL and your your LDL is kind of like, the bad cholesterol, and, your HDL is, the quote, good cholesterol, and, your triglycerides should be as low as possible. But honestly, the more we're learning about LDL in general, we realize that all LDL is not exactly the same. There's some LDL particles that are very big and some that are very small. And it turns out that just getting the LDL number isn't telling you anything about how dangerous the actual LDL that you have is. In other words, if you have large and fluffy, big LDLs, then it's actually a much lower risk. But if you have these really, really tiny LDLs, then that is actually much more dangerous. And what this NMR Lipo Profile does, it tells you how much of the small LDL that you have. So it's basically refining the LDL. In other words, getting more detail about LDL to know whether or not it is dangerous for you. It's giving you a total count of LDL, but ultimately to know whether you have these big fluffy ones or little tiny ones. There have been some studies to show that people who have these really tiny ones, that when you're eating fat in combination with high glycemic foods, so, processed flours, that can actually lead to much smaller LDL. And your LDL might not even be that elevated. But if it's all small LDL because of some of the dietary choices you've made, that is going to convey a much higher risk in terms of your cardiovascular risk. The other thing is this LPIR, which is part of the test that you get, the report that you get. And this is a measure of insulin resistance. So, and it makes sense, now we realize that all of these things play into this sort of notion of getting your metabolism right. And if you have insulin resistance, then obviously that's going to cause an enormous amount of problems, because it's going to lead to, it's going to be an indicator potentially of diabetes. So this NMR Lipo Profile, you can get it at, LabCorp or Quest, those labs, and even LabCorp as an example. If you're familiar with that, oftentimes when you go to your doctor and they order blood work, the two biggest companies, it seems, are LabCorp and Quest. And both of those companies now have like not memberships, but they have a way for you as an individual to order these tests for yourself. So they see what's going on, in the sense that probably they see it as an additional revenue source for people ordering tests. But you can certainly, most forward-thinking doctors know what an NMR Lipo Profile is. So it really gives you an enormous improvement over just LDL, HDL, triglycerides. Those are obviously important for for societal general recommendations, but we're not that way here. Here we are focused on really taking control of things and knowing things from a little bit of a deeper perspective. So definitely you want to get an NMR Lipo Profile. I get one for myself every year, and I'll be getting one this Friday, actually. Oxidized LDL, same thing. Remember now, years and years of measuring LDL, we're starting to understand that just LDL on its own is probably not that good of a measure. Additionally, oxidized LDL, so you have is this much more dangerous. It can penetrate the wall of the artery. When it penetrates the wall of the artery, then you get these foamy cells that basically create what is essentially heart disease. So you can measure oxidized LDL. Certainly the combination of these two are going to give you an enormous amount of information. So, I think certainly if all your life you've just been getting LDL and HDL and triglycerides from your doctor, there's no question that you should get an NMR Lipo Profile. No, there's no question about it. It really gives you a lot more detail. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to get oxidized LDL, but definitely you want to get this lipo profile. Next is high sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP. And this is associated with inflammation, overall, what we call systemic inflammation. And there have been some studies to show that when people have elevated high sensitivity CRP, they're at a much increased risk for heart disease. But I must say that I look at it as a general indicator of inflammation. And that's usually a result of lifestyle choices. It certainly could be a result of certain diseases and conditions, but generally for the general population, again, you could have a level of inflammation in your body that you're not even necessarily aware of. So I think high sensitivity CRP is another test that I think that you should consider getting. And I would just say that there's always a reticence to either asking your doctor or ordering these. It's possible that you might go to your doctor and say, I want an NMR Lipo Profile, and they might not. They might. Some doctors get threatened by patients who are forward thinking and who want to craft their own healthcare plan. Again, anyone on this class is looking to go deeper than basic medical evaluations, and so that's the whole purpose of my classes here. So I say that because I want you to be strong and make the choice to know what your numbers are, what your levels are, so that you can be more proactive about living longer, healthier life. And that's sort of how I see it. Apolipoprotein B is also a general indicator of not everything pretty much that's not HDL gets sort of lumped into apolipoprotein B, and is a very good indicator of overall risk. So that's another blood test. If I had to pick one out of these, again, the NMR Lipo Profile is going to give you a lot of information. Homocysteine, there are some people with some genetic issues that result in high levels of homocysteine in their blood, and this actually can damage the walls of the artery. And so some people have, again, some genetic issues with that. B vitamins and things like that can lower this. So that's another blood test. Vitamin D, of course, we all know that everyone should know. You should absolutely know what your vitamin D level is. Vitamin D is so important for so many things across your body that it's incredibly important for you to know what that is. CBC, which is just your complete blood count, should be part of your sort of yearly check. And of course, that's something that your doctor is definitely going to order. I'm going to add here just a couple things that just occurred to me. And so next is something called lipoprotein A. You only need to most preventive cardiologists these days, only, at least the ones I've spoken to, only get this once in a lifetime. If you're elevated, there is an increased risk overall for heart disease. And it's good to know, especially if you have a family history of heart disease with people having heart problems at a very early age, you want to get your lipoprotein A level checked. I would say, believe it or not, especially if you're on some kind of program to really have a clear understanding of your reaction to food, is to just buy a cheap glucometer, which is where you can stick your finger and you get a little drop of blood and you check your blood glucose. And for some people, believe it or not, they're wearing continuous glucose monitors on the back of their arms because years ago, not that many years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there was a study out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel that showed that depending on our microbiome, believe it or not, you can sort of look at the microbiome and predict what kind of blood sugar elevations that you get in response to certain foods. And what was amazing about these studies is that there were people who they would eat a banana, and one set of people would their blood sugar would just spike, would go through the roof. Now, of course, we've spoken about many times how if you're getting a spike in your blood sugar, that is basically associated with increased aging. I mean, you're going to age faster if your blood sugar is spiking, in addition to a whole host of other problems, including emotional, um, you know, emotional issues from blood sugar going up and down, abnormal cravings. This can lead to things like binge eating. All these sorts of things can happen as a result of blood sugar going up and going down. But again, we're looking at it from a perspective of health span, and if your blood sugar is spiking up, that's an issue. So having a glucometer is not a bad idea, especially if you feel like there might be certain foods that you might be reacting to in terms of a blood sugar spike. The studies that were done in Israel at Weizmann Institute really showed that, again, there would be people who they could have, they would eat ice cream and their blood sugar didn't even go up. And then there were other people, depending on their microbiome, that their blood sugar just spiked through the roof. And what they did was they did something called computational biology, which is where they were able to look at your microbiome and make educated, very accurate predictions about which foods are going to cause your blood sugar to spike. And sometimes they're completely not intuitive. It could be that, having a pizza or something that you would, a piece of cake or something you would expect your blood sugar to spike. But for some people, it's not going to spike. That doesn't mean you should, for those people, indulge in cake. But the point is the more control we have over your blood sugar and your blood sugar spikes, the better control for long-term health, which basically leads to hemoglobin A1C, which is, again, your average blood sugar over a certain span of time. And everyone should know what their levels are for hemoglobin A1C. It's easy to get. It's a cheap test. Your doctor will definitely order it for you. And you should really have an understanding of what that is for the same reasons that I've been talking about, which is that you really got to get your blood sugar under control. And the additional thing is that when your blood sugar is spiking, so is your insulin. And if your insulin is, because if your blood sugar spikes, your body releases insulin to bring the blood sugar down. If your insulin levels are high, unfortunately, one, that could lead eventually to insulin resistance and diabetes. But two, when your insulin levels are high, your body actually can't break down fat. It turns off an enzyme called lipase, which breaks down fat. So if your insulin levels are high, then you're not going to be able to break down fat, which is another reason why in some people who I help with weight loss, we get an insulin level to see what the fasting insulin level is. If it's very high, then we really need to work on getting the insulin level down, because as the insulin level drops over time, then your body is able to burn fat, and that's going to be important in general. So next is the omega index, and that's basically an indicator of the amount of omega-3s in your, I believe they use red blood cells for that. And you want to have a good balance of omega-3s, a certain percentage of the fatty acids. And so the omega index is going to be important, because when people do not have a real, if this is off, then that can be associated with overall inflammatory state. When people have too much omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, which you can read from the omega index, then that means that they may be eating too many vegetable oils, which are omega-6. They might not be getting any omega-3s if they're, say, vegan or vegetarian. It might be that, for example, they might have to take a omega-3 supplement. For vegans or vegetarians, that can be done through plant-based source of omega-3s that they use algae for. But ultimately, Additionally, there's some issues with brain functioning as well when your omega index is completely off. So you really want to get that in order. Just carrying forward what I've mentioned a few times tonight, which is this issue of vegetable oils, seed oils. So things like sunflower, safflower, um, those sorts of seed oils are really not good for you. They're going to mess up your omega index. They're often oxidized. So we're learning about how certain oxidized things are not so good for you. They're going to mess up this omega index. And so you want to try to focus on making sure the fats that you're getting are not going to be these sort of rancid seed oils. Unfortunately, when you go out to eat, you really don't know what kind of oils they're using. So it is difficult to eat out because unless you're going to, a very high quality, Italian or Greek restaurant where it would be a sacrilege if they didn't use a high quality olive oil. Other restaurants are often blending their olive oil with canola oil. This is sort of a hidden secret, and there was an article about all the restaurants in the Bay Area and in the wine country about how most of the top restaurants even were cutting their olive oil with canola oil because it's so much cheaper and it's not going to put necessarily any kind of off-putting flavor that would be able to be detected. So unfortunately, when you're eating out, it's difficult. I pay attention to the oils. I try to when I'm eating out, but ultimately it's one of those things that is, maybe if you're eating, you can ask if they're just using olive oil or whatever the case may be. But again, eating out can be very difficult. Okay, so really a little bit of a quicker 30-minute class tonight, and just wanted to review, middle-aged people who have an increased risk. We just want to focus on taking control of your health destiny by knowing your numbers and being a little proactive and potentially slightly aggressive to be able to ask your doctor, or as I said, order for yourself these blood tests. So that's all I have for tonight. Next week, we're actually going to be discussing vaccines because I had my vaccine yesterday, so my second shot, so I feel a little bit achy tonight. But I want to talk next week about really having a clear understanding of what vaccinations are, what the risks are, clear up some of the confusion over the vaccines that we're all getting, a lot of us are getting, and really understand how effective or not effective they are, and how they work as well, because there's a lot of unusual information out there. And then also talk about looking at it from the perspective of personal health versus public health. What I mean by that is that vaccine, there are really some interesting, there's some very interesting discussions that I've listened to over the last couple weeks. One is with a doctor by the name of Paul Offit. He's a pediatrician from Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, and is usually the guy that they get on the news when they want to talk about vaccines. He invented the rotavirus vaccine, which has saved, thousands of children from diarrhea that caused death many years ago. And there have been some amazing conversations with him, and he's of the opinion that everyone should be made to get a vaccine because he's looking at things from the perspective of public health. And there has to be a distinction made between looking at things from public health and from personal health. And when it comes to thinking about vaccines, that distinction is actually quite important. And while I probably I tend to agree with him on some of the issues regarding vaccines, I certainly feel like we all should have the choice. But we'll go into why doctors quite reasonably have concerns about people who don't get the vaccine. So I think by the end of the class next week, you'll get a better understanding and understand both sides of the story, as well as some really fascinating history when it comes to understanding vaccines. So thank you again for your attention. I know it's a little bit more of an abbreviated class tonight, but I do hope that some of you, hopefully all of you, will really be proactive. And if you actually order these tests, I think, we're getting, by the time this sort of gets out to my email list and, we get some views on YouTube, there's probably, probably a couple hundred people who see the presentation. So you can always reach out to me as well. I'd be happy to look at some of the labs after you get them. Certainly has to go through, ultimately has to be recorded by and stored in your medical record with your doctor, but I'm certainly willing to give you some feedback on some of these tests. What else can I say? I look forward to seeing you next week. Hope everyone stays well, and I'll see you next Wednesday night. Have a great night. Bye-bye.